The British government didn't want the colonies to unite as suggested at Albany, and they didn't trust this union to handle their own defense. They were worried the colonies might become too strong militarily and realize their own power, as there were suspicions and distrust towards them at the time. So they sent General Braddock with 2 regiments of regular English soldiers for this task. He arrived in Alexandria, Virginia, and then marched to Fredericktown, Maryland, where he stopped to wait for wagons. Our local government, the Assembly, heard from some information that he had strong negative opinions about them, thinking they didn't want to help. So they asked me to go see him, not officially from them, but as the Postmaster General. The idea was to pretend I was there to figure out the fastest and most reliable way to send messages between him and the governors of the different provinces, since he'd need to communicate with them constantly, and the Assembly offered to cover the costs. My son came with me. We found the general in Fredericktown, anxiously waiting for the people he'd sent into the rural areas of Maryland and Virginia to gather wagons. I stayed with him for several days, ate with him every day, and had plenty of chances to change his mind. I explained what the Assembly had already done before he arrived and what they were still prepared to do to help his mission. Just as I was about to leave, the reports came in about how many wagons they'd managed to get. It turned out there were only 25, and not all of them were in good working order. The general and all his officers were shocked. They declared the expedition was over, saying it was impossible to continue. They complained loudly about the government ministers for foolishly sending them to a country that had no way to transport their supplies, luggage, and so on, when at least 150 wagons were needed. I happened to mention that it was a shame they hadn't landed in Pennsylvania instead, because almost every farmer there owned a wagon. The general quickly seized on my words and said, "Then you, sir, being an influential person there, can probably get them for us, and I urge you to take on this task." I asked what conditions would be offered to the wagon owners, and I was asked to write down the terms I thought were fair. I did this, and they were approved. A formal authorization and instructions were prepared right away. What those terms were will be clear from the advertisement I published as soon as I got to Lancaster. Because of the big and quick impact it had, it's quite interesting, so I'll include it in full here.
Advertisement. April 26, 1755. Lancaster. Notice: 150 wagons, each with 4 horses, and 1,500 saddle or pack horses are needed for the King's Army, which is gathering at Wills Creek. General Braddock has authorized me to arrange for their hire. I am announcing that I will be in Lancaster from today until next Wednesday evening, and in York from next Thursday morning till Friday evening. There I will be ready to make agreements for wagons and teams or individual horses under the following conditions. 1. For each wagon with 4 good horses and a driver, 15 shillings per day will be paid. For each strong horse with a pack saddle or other saddle and gear, 2 shillings per day. For each strong horse without a saddle, 18 pence per day. 2. Payment will start from the moment they join the troops at Wills Creek, which must be by May 20th. An additional fair amount will be paid for the travel time to Wills Creek and back home after their service ends. 3. Each wagon, team, and every saddle or pack horse will be valued by neutral individuals chosen by both me and the owner. If any wagon, team, or horse is lost while in service, its value, as determined by this assessment, will be paid. 4. 7 days' pay will be given as an advance by me to the owner of each wagon, team, or horse at the time of signing the contract if requested. The rest will be paid by General Braddock or the Army's paymaster when their service ends or as requested over time. 5. Wagon drivers or those caring for the hired horses will absolutely not be asked to act as soldiers or be employed in any other way than driving or looking after their wagons or horses. 6. Any extra oats, corn, or other feed that wagons or horses bring to camp beyond what's needed for the horse's own food will be taken for the Army's use, and a fair price will be paid for it. Note: my son, William Franklin, is authorized to make similar contracts with anyone in Cumberland County. B. Franklin.
Friends and countrymen, a few days ago I happened to be at the camp in Frederick, and I found the general and his officers extremely angry because they hadn't received the horses and carriages they expected from this province, which was considered the most capable of providing them. However, due to disagreements between our governor and the Assembly, no money had been set aside, and no steps had been taken to get them. It was suggested that an armed force be sent immediately into these counties to seize as many of the best carriages and horses as needed, and to force as many people as necessary to drive and care for them. I was worried that British soldiers marching through these counties for such a purpose, especially given their current mood and their anger towards us, would cause a lot of trouble and inconvenience for the residents. That's why I was more than willing to try first to see what could be achieved through fair and reasonable means. The people in these rural counties have recently complained to the Assembly that there wasn't enough money circulating. Now you have a chance to receive and share a very significant amount of money. For if this expedition lasts, which is very likely, for 120 days, the rental cost for these wagons and horses will add up to over £30,000, which will be paid to you in the King's silver and gold currency. The work will be light and easy, as the Army will barely march more than 12 miles a day. The wagons and baggage horses, since they carry essential supplies for the Army's well-being, must march with the Army and no faster. For the Army's safety, they are always placed in the most secure positions, whether marching or in camp. If you are truly, as I believe you are, good and loyal subjects to His Majesty, you can now perform a very valuable service and make things easy for yourselves. For example, 3 or 4 people who can't individually spare a wagon, 4 horses, and a driver from their farm work can team up. One can provide the wagon, another 1 or 2 horses, and another the driver, and you can divide the pay proportionally among yourselves. But if you don't voluntarily offer this service to your king and country when such good pay and reasonable terms are offered, your loyalty will be seriously questioned. The king's work must be done. So many brave troops who have come so far to defend you must not be left idle because you are unwilling to do what is reasonably expected of you. Wagons and horses must be obtained. Forceful methods will probably be used, and you will be left to find compensation wherever you can, and your situation, perhaps, will receive little sympathy or attention. I have no personal stake in this matter, as, apart from the satisfaction of trying to do good, I will only get my effort for my trouble. If this way of getting wagons and horses doesn't seem likely to work, I am required to inform the General in 14 days, and I assume Sir John Sinclair, the Hussar, with a group of soldiers, will immediately enter the province for that purpose, which I would be sorry to hear, because I am very sincerely and truly your friend and well-wisher, B. Franklin. I received about £800 from the general to pay as advance money to the wagon owners, etc. But that wasn't enough, so I put in over £200 more of my own money. Within 2 weeks, all 150 wagons, along with 259 pack horses, were on their way to the camp. The advertisement had promised that if any wagon or horse was lost, payment would be made based on its assessed value. However, the owners said they didn't know General Braddock and weren't sure if they could trust his promise. They insisted on my personal guarantee, a bond that the agreement would be honored, which I gave them. One evening, while I was at the camp, having dinner with the officers of Colonel Dunbar's regiment, he told me he was worried about the junior officers. He said they generally weren't wealthy and could barely afford to buy the supplies they'd need for such a long march through the wilderness, where nothing could be bought. I felt bad for them and decided to try and get them some help. I didn't tell him my plan, though. The next morning, I wrote to the Assembly Committee, who managed some public funds, strongly recommending that they consider these officers' situation and suggesting that a gift of essential items and refreshments be sent to them. My son, who knew a bit about camp life and what soldiers needed, made a list for me, which I included in my letter. The committee approved and worked so quickly that, guided by my son, the supplies arrived at the camp at the same time as the wagons. There were 20 packages, each containing these 20 well-packed parcels were loaded onto 20 horses, with each parcel and horse meant as a gift for one officer. They were received very gratefully, and the colonels of both regiments sent me letters expressing their thanks in the warmest terms. The general was also very pleased with how I handled getting him the wagons and so on. He quickly paid my expense report, thanked me many times, and asked for my continued help in sending provisions after him. I took on this task too, and was busy with it until we heard about his defeat. I advanced over £1,000 sterling of my own money for this service, and I sent him a bill for it. Luckily for me, it reached him a few days before the battle, and he immediately sent me an order to the paymaster for a round sum of £1,000, leaving the rest for a later bill. I consider this payment good fortune, as I was never able to get the remaining amount, but more on that later. I believe this general was a brave man and probably would have been a good officer in a European war. But he was too overconfident, thought too highly of regular soldiers, and had a very low opinion of both Americans and Native Americans. George Crohan, our interpreter for the Native Americans, joined him on his march with 100 of these people. They could have been very helpful to his army as guides, scouts, and so on if he had treated them well. But he ignored and mistreated them, and they slowly left him. One day, while talking with him, he was telling me about his planned route. He said, "After taking Fort Duquesne, I'm going to Niagara, and after taking that, to Frontenac if the season allows enough time. And I expect it will, because Duquesne can hardly hold me up for more than 3 or 4 days. After that, I don't see anything that can stop my march to Niagara." I had already thought about how long his army's line would be marching on a very narrow road that had to be cut through the woods and bushes. I also remembered reading about a previous defeat of 1,500 French soldiers who invaded the Iroquois country. Because of this, I had some doubts and fears about how the campaign would turn out. But I only dared to say, "Of course, sir. If you arrive at Duquesne with these excellent troops, so well equipped with artillery, and since the place isn't fully fortified yet, and, as we hear, doesn't have a very strong garrison, it will probably only put up a short fight. The only danger I foresee stopping your march is from ambushes by Native Americans. They are skilled at setting and carrying out ambushes because of constant practice. And the thin line, nearly 4 miles long, that your army will form might expose it to surprise attacks on its sides, and it could be cut like a thread into several pieces, which, due to their distance, wouldn't be able to support each other in time." He smiled at my lack of knowledge and replied, These savages might indeed be a tough enemy for your inexperienced American militia, but against the king's regular and disciplined troops, sir, it's impossible for them to make any impact. I felt it was inappropriate for me to argue with a military man about his profession, so I said nothing more. However, the enemy didn't take advantage of his army's long marching line, as I had feared. Instead, they let it advance without interruption until it was within 9 miles of the fort. Then, when the army was more grouped together, because it had just crossed a river where the front had waited for everyone to get across, and in a more open part of the woods than any it had passed, they attacked its advance guard with heavy gunfire from behind trees and bushes. This was the first time the general realized an enemy was nearby. With this guard in disarray, the general rushed the troops forward to help them, which was done in great confusion, pushing through wagons, baggage, and cattle. Soon the gunfire hit their flank. The officers, being on horseback, were easier to spot, picked out his targets, and fell very quickly. The soldiers were crammed together in a confused mass, not having or hearing any orders, and just stood there to be shot until 2/3 of them were killed. Then, seized with panic, the entire force fled in a rush. The wagon drivers each took a horse from their team and ran off. Others immediately followed their example, so all the wagons, food, artillery, and supplies were abandoned to the enemy. The general, who was wounded, was brought away with difficulty. His secretary, Mr. Shirley, was killed right beside him. Out of 86 officers, 63 were killed or wounded, and 714 men were killed out of 1,100. These 1,100 were the best men chosen from the entire army. The rest had been left behind with Colonel Dunbar, who was supposed to follow with the heavier supplies, food and baggage. The fleeing soldiers, not being chased, reached Dunbar's camp, and the panic they carried with them immediately infected him and all his men. Even though he now had over 1,000 men, and the enemy who defeated Braddock was at most only 400 Native Americans and French combined, instead of moving forward and trying to regain some lost honor, he ordered all the supplies, ammunition, and so on to be destroyed. He did this so he would have more horses to help him escape towards the settlements and less stuff to move. There he was met with requests from the governors of Virginia, Maryland, and Pennsylvania asking him to station his troops on the frontier to protect the residents. But he continued his hurried march through the entire country, not feeling safe until he reached Philadelphia, where the residents could protect him. This whole event made us Americans suspect for the first time that our high opinions of the bravery of British regular soldiers might not have been accurate. Also, during their initial march, from when they landed until they passed the settled areas, they looted and robbed the residents, completely ruining some poor families. On top of that, they insulted, abused, and imprisoned people if they dared to complain. This was enough to make us lose faith in such defenders, if we had even wanted any in the first place. How different was the behavior of our French allies in 1781, who, during a march of nearly 700 miles through the most populated parts of our country, from Rhode Island to Virginia, didn't cause a single complaint about the loss of a pig, a chicken, or even an apple. Captain Orme, one of the general's aides who was badly wounded and brought off with him, stayed with him until his death a few days later. Orme told me that the general was completely silent all the first day, and at night only said nothing more. He was silent again the next day, saying only, "At last, nothing more," and died a few minutes later. The secretary's papers, including all the general's orders, instructions, and letters, fell into enemy hands. They picked out and translated several documents into French, which they then printed to show that the British government had hostile intentions before the war was officially declared. Among these, I saw some letters from the general to the government ministers, speaking highly of the great help I had given the army and recommending me for their attention. David Hume, who years later was secretary to Lord Hertford when he was minister in France, and then to General Conway when he was Secretary of State, also told me he had seen letters from Braddock strongly recommending me among the papers in that office. However, since the expedition failed, my service apparently wasn't considered very valuable, because those recommendations never did me any good. As for personal rewards from him, I only asked for one thing, that he would order his officers not to recruit any more of our indentured servants, and that he would release those who had already joined up. He agreed to this right away, and several servants were returned to their masters because I asked. Dunbar, when he took command, wasn't as kind. When he was in Philadelphia, retreating, or rather fleeing, I asked him to release the servants of 3 poor farmers from Lancaster County whom he had enlisted, reminding him of the previous general's orders on this matter. He promised me that if the masters came to him in Trenton, where he would be in a few days on his way to New York, he would hand their men over to them there. So they went to the expense and trouble of traveling to Trenton, but there he refused to keep his promise, causing them great loss and disappointment. As soon as everyone found out about the lost wagons and horses, all the owners came to me demanding the payment I had guaranteed with my bond. Their demands caused me a lot of trouble. I told them the money was ready with the paymaster, but that General Shirley first needed to approve the payments. I also assured them I had written to the general, but since he was far away, an answer wouldn't come quickly, and they needed to be patient. None of this was enough to satisfy them, and some even started suing me. General Shirley eventually rescued me from this awful situation by appointing officials to review the claims and ordering the payments. The total came to nearly £20,000, which would have financially ruined me if I had to pay it myself. Before we heard about this defeat, the 2 doctors Bond came to me with a paper to collect money for a big fireworks display. They planned to put on this celebration when we got the news that we had captured Fort Duquesne. I looked serious and said I thought it would be soon enough to get ready for a celebration once we actually knew we had something to celebrate. They seemed surprised that I didn't immediately agree to their idea. "Why the devil," one of them exclaimed, "you surely don't think the fort won't be taken?" I replied, "I don't know that it won't be taken, but I do know that things in war are very unpredictable." I explained why I was doubtful. The fundraising was dropped, and because of that, the organizers avoided the embarrassment they would have faced if the fireworks had been prepared. Later, on another occasion, Dr. Bond said he didn't like Franklin's predictions. Governor Morris had constantly bothered the Assembly with message after message before Braddock's defeat. He was trying to force them to pass laws to raise money for the province's defense, but without taxing, among other things, the estates owned by the proprietors. He had rejected all their proposed laws because they didn't include such an exemption. Now, with the danger and need being greater, he intensified his efforts, hoping for more success. The Assembly, however, stood firm, believing they were in the right, and that it would mean giving up a crucial right if they let the governor change their money-related bills. In one of the last bills, which was for granting £50,000, his suggested change was only a single word. The bill stated that all estates, real and personal, were to be taxed, those of the proprietaries excepted. His amendment was, for Reed, a small but very material alteration. However, when news of this disaster reached England, our friends there, whom we had made sure to keep informed with all the Assembly's responses to the governor's messages, started complaining loudly against the proprietors. They accused them of being stingy and unfair for giving their governor such instructions. Some even went as far as to say that by hindering the defense of their province, the proprietors had lost their right to it. They were scared by this backlash and sent orders to their chief financial officer to add £5,000 of their own money to whatever sum the Assembly might provide for this purpose. When this was announced to the House, it was accepted as their contribution instead of being part of a general tax. A new bill was then created, including an exemption clause, and it passed. Through this law, I was appointed one of the commissioners responsible for managing the £60,000. I had played a key role in shaping the bill and getting it passed. At the same time, I had also drafted a bill to create and organize a volunteer militia, which I got through the House without much trouble, as care was taken to allow Quakers to opt out. To encourage the formation of this militia, I wrote a dialogue that presented and answered every possible objections I could think of against such a militia. It was printed and, I believe, had a significant impact. By chance,